and the first documented incident occurred in 1898 year, when a group of prospectors consisting of 6 people, having collected supplies, tools, and weapons, went to the valley in search of gold. It was the height of the gold rush. California's gold was already running out. The fever moved to Yukon, Klondike, Sidecar, gold mines in the city of Nome, and so on and so on. People were raving about gold, but the Yukon and Alaska were already very crowded. There were a lot of people willing to buy gold. Therefore, it was logical to look in the wildlands, where you could find an untouched vein and fabulously get rich. And 6 prospectors decide to try their luck in the valley on Hannah, but disappear without a trace. In those days, no one attached much importance to this. People in the Canadian wilderness disappeared regularly, so no one noticed the missing prospectors, and did not even start looking for them. However, a few years later, a hunter who happened to be in the valley made an unusual find. It was a small camp, and obviously what was left of the prospectors. And the strangest thing was that the skeletons were holding onto weapons and had no heads. The heads themselves, or rather the skulls, were carefully placed at the feet. But even these strange facts did not particularly confuse anyone. It was announced that the animals simply fed on the bodies, so the heads lay separately. There was only one tiny article about this incident in the Yukon newspaper, where the names of the victims were not even mentioned. And here we turn to the second incident, about which we already know much more. In 1904, 3 brothers Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who lived in the northwest lands of Canada, decided that they would also go in search of gold in the valley on the Con. The gold rush was already on the decline, everything was rummaged and divided. And they logically believed that since there were almost no people in the valley, it was possible to find untouched deposits there, which the prospectors had not yet reached. And after a very long and difficult passage on sled dogs and makeshift boats, they finally slipped into the valley on the Con, and found themselves on the Flat River, which flows through it. And don't be confused by the name. Flat River translates as a flat river. However, it is not flat at all. It is very complex, stormy, and full of rapids. But one way or another, the brothers land on the shore, set up camp, and start looking for gold. They place so-called golden sluices on the streams. The Golden Gateway is a box, the lower part of which is a kind of sieve. It is placed on the river, and the current itself throws nuggets into this trap, and the prospectors only need to take them out of the sieve. So, having put up the golden locks, the brothers realized that the river was full of gold. They have been washing it diligently for several days and gaining a solid amount. But they decide to return to the city as soon as possible to claim this plot and, so to speak, stake it out, until someone else did it. In addition, they are going to hire workers and buy more equipment to turn around in full force. And they load the gold into the boat and start rafting on the river. But on one of the rapids, the boat crashes into a rock and shatters into splinters. The gold is sinking, as is most of the supplies. However, the brothers get ashore unharmed. And already on foot, they returned back to the camp. Stocks were running out, and they did not have time to wash more gold. So after a few days, they built a new boat and left the valley empty-handed. As soon as they return home, the 2 younger brothers Willie and Frank begin to make plans to return to the valley on the Con. Charlie's older brother obviously didn't like drowning in the river, and therefore he says that he will not return there again, and will not participate. Then the guys call their friend named Robert Weir, who agrees to join them and wash gold in the valley on Con. In the spring of 1905, they were back in the valley. Charlie, who had stayed in town, had been waiting for the brothers to return for a long time. A month, 6 months, a year passes. But Charlie still isn't worried. In those days, people often left their homes for long periods. And Charlie thought they had found gold and wanted to get as much as possible. But when 2 years have passed, he has already started to worry and is assembling a search expedition. Charlie and 4 other people from his town walked the entire Flat River and found no trace of the brothers. They sailed through huge canyons, where the rocks were covered with caves where no man had ever set foot. And finally, they notice a white spot on the shore. When they got ashore, they saw a human body lying in front of the tent. And this body has no head. Some of the clothes seem to have been burned, and the hand was reaching for the rifle, which was carefully leaning against the nearest tree. They entered what was left of the tent, and there they found a second body, which also had a missing head. And Charlie identified his brother's from his personal belongings. The third prospector, Robert Weir, was not found in the camp. However, a few months later, parts of a skeleton were found downstream, which could well belong to Robert. But, as you understand, at that time the examination was not carried out, and what happened in the camp remained a mystery. The only clue was the inscription carved on the tree, "We found a great vein." However, there was no gold in the camp, and even locks or signs of mining were not found nearby either. The official conclusion of the police was that all three men died of starvation, and after their death, the animals dragged their heads away. Charlie McClute openly stated that this version is complete nonsense, since he personally saw the burned clothes on the bodies. He believed that they were attacked by local tribes. However, the police refused to analyze this version. The people in the pubs agreed that the guys had washed the gold after all, and Robert Weir did not want to share, and eliminated the companions. He escaped with the gold, but he drowned in the river. The area around Nahanni begins to acquire a bad reputation and get the nickname of the Valley of the Headless. But in addition to fear, this story also arouses furious interest among prospectors, who reasoned that there is a lot of gold there. And some even call the valley the Canadian El Dorado. And a few years later, in 1913, a gold digger named Martin Jorgensen decided that he would not let some scary stories prevent him from getting rich. Prospector Jorgensen made a very difficult journey on foot to the Flat River, where he put up a small hut, as he planned to explore gold deposits, winter, and next summer meet with his companions in the town of Yellowknife, to answer them exactly whether there is gold there or not, and discuss further actions. But just a few days after he built the hut, he boarded a boat and rafted to the nearest post, where he sent a letter to his companions, in which he said that he had become fabulously rich. Jorgensen's partners, inspired, began to prepare an expedition for the next summer, to throw workers there and open a full-fledged gold mine. But the summer passed, and there was no news from Martin. And then, hiring an Indian guide, they headed up the Flat River, approximately to the place where Martin, according to his last letter, was supposed to build a hut. And they really found the hut and Martin himself. More precisely, what's left of it. Jorgensen's hut burned to the ground, and on the ground next to the blackened structure lay the remains of a man. And, of course, the prospectors' partners carefully examined everything for gold, but found nothing. The police again said it was an accident, and the investigation was quickly dropped. But this incident got into the newspapers and increased interest in the valley. And here we come to the fourth incident. 7 years later, in 1921st year, an experienced hunter, John O'Brien, was found frozen in a valley on Con. O'Brien was sitting in front of a lit fire. He was not in a freezing pose, but his face expressed calmness. He was clutching a matchbox in his hand, as if he was just sitting down to warm himself by the fire, when something made him suddenly freeze. Those who discovered him claimed that it looked as if something had suddenly frozen him. But in this case, the head was in place, and hunters in northern Canada freeze with enviable regularity. This did not surprise anyone. More strange was the fifth incident in the valley on Con. In 1926 year, a girl named Mela Ferdi disappeared while hunting in the valley. Mela Ferdi was the cousin of the wife of the hunter Poole Field. In the summer of 26, she accompanied Poole, his wife Mary, and a group of Indians from Fort Simpson on a hunting trip to the valley. The group has just spent the winter setting traps for fur-bearing animals in the Mackenzie Mountains, and headed for one of the trading posts on the Laird River. Mela Ferdi and her relatives were mestizos, who led this hunting party and earned their living by hunting skins. But at the river, which will later be called Mary River in honor of Poole's wife, the girl suddenly disappears. Initially, everyone thought that she went to the toilet and just got lost. Poole and 5 hunters went looking for her. All of them were experienced trackers, and quickly found traces of the missing. Filt and his companions followed May's trail for a total of 9 days. Along the way, they found the remains of her torn clothes. They hung from the branches of trees. It seemed that the girl gradually threw off her clothes on the run until she was completely naked. And there are also enough mosquitoes in those places, as you understand. The girl was never found, and the search was stopped, referring to the fact that without clothes she would freeze in a few nights anyway. However, this story had an unexpected sequel. This story, of course, was written in the local newspapers, and an Indian hunter named Big Charlie contacted the police with a message. He said that when he was hunting in the valley near the Third Canyon, he set up camp on the bank of the Flat River, and woke up late in the evening to the sound of a stone falling into the water. The river was illuminated by moonlight, and 100 yards away he saw a naked girl. She was on all fours and suddenly ran down the side of the cliff. He described her movements as animals. But most of all, he remembered the expression on her face when she periodically stopped and looked around like a wild animal. Charlie described it as a grimacing grin, as if her expression was frozen, and her eyes were wide and absolutely insane. The police did not believe the Indian and did not conduct an additional investigation. But the creek where May disappeared has been called May Creek ever since. But let's move on. Perhaps one of the most striking characters of the Valley of the Headless was a certain Yukon fisher. This man succumbed to the gold rush, got to the Klondike along the Ashford Trail, and wandered around the Yukon, until he had a fight with a bartender in one of the salons and broke his head with a bottle. Prospector Billy Clark remembers it like this: there was blood all over it. Fisher was sure he had killed this guy, so he escaped into the woods. And Hammerson Peters writes about it like this: he lived in complete isolation, avoiding both Indians and white people. Occasionally, a 2-meter hermit dressed in animal skins was seen at remote northern trading posts. For example, in the shop of the above-mentioned Pool Field. It was located on the Rose River. There he stocked up on tea, salt, matches and ammunition before disappearing into the woods again. Pool Field said that Fisher developed a sense of the wild animal as a result of his primitive lifestyle and could easily distinguish elk, caribou, bear and man by the sounds they made when walking through the forest. However, the finale of this fugitive's life is unknown to us. Incident number 6. In 1929th year, 3 prospectors again go in search of gold in the valley. Obviously, they didn't learn from the mistakes of others. They were George Gilroy, Andy Hay, and Angus Hall. Camping near the mouth of Scow Creek, they tried to wash the gold. But soon there was a conflict between the men, and Angus Hall went into the woods in a fit of anger. Later that evening, his partners saw him climbing up the cliff. His companions expected Hall to come back after letting off some steam, so even when night fell, they didn't worry too much, and just fell asleep, hoping that Hall would return in the morning. However, Angus was still nowhere to be seen the next morning. They went further up Bennett Creek, where they found a lone footprint on the bank of the creek, left by a nail-studded shoe, the shoe worn by their missing companion. Gilroy and Hay met with another group of 4 prospectors, and after having lunch together continued their unsuccessful search for the Hall. The body of prospector Angus Hall has never been found. A year after Hall's disappearance, a hunter named Phil Powers arrived in the valley on Con. He was an honest and experienced mountain man, as his friends described him. Powers built himself a cabin at the mouth of Irwin Creek and began setting traps. In a few months, a group of hunters a few kilometers from the burned-down hut of Prospector Jorgensen will find traps with the skeletons of lynxes and foxes, which no one took away. And at the confluence of the Caribou and Flat Rivers, they came across the remains of Powers' canoe. Finally, they reached the mouth of Irwin Creek, and after walking, they came to the place where Phil's cabin was located. And like the hut of the prospector Jorgensen, it was burned to the ground, and among the ashes, the black bones of the hunter were found. There are conflicting reports about the condition of the corpse. Some say that Powers was found without a head, and his skeleton was clutching a single-shot revolver in his fingers. Others claim that the hunter's skull was found at his feet. The investigation again blamed the faulty furnace for everything. The hunters believed that someone standing outside the window shot Powers as he lay in his bunk, and then set fire to the hut. Incident number 8. In December 1935, Joe Dalzell, a dog driver, brought 2 fur trappers to the valley, Joe Mulholland and Bill Epler. The hunters are missing. After a while, the brother of one of them hired Joe as a guide and arranged a search. Dalzell delivered them to the place where he had originally dropped off the 2 hunters a few months ago. Nearby, the remains of a hut were found, which, like the previous ones, burned to the ground. And already in May, 1936th year, a group of hunters at the confluence of the Flat and Honey Rivers came across a fire pit, which, as it was established, was only a few days old. Moving down the south on Hannah, they came across several trees cut down with axes. And since Mulholland and Epler could be the only people in the valley, they thought that these were their footprints. The following winter, 2 hunters named L. Lewis and Harry Vandal entered the valley and stumbled upon a series of strange camps. Lewis described them as hiding places, each of which included a piece of neatly folded tarpaulin, as well as various items that lay on top, from empty tobacco cans to a withered wolf paw. The disappearance of the 2 hunters gave rise to many rumors, but in the end, no trace was ever found. Strange disappearances in the valley were beginning to gain momentum. Or, more precisely, with the development of mass media, we began to learn more about them. In 1940th year, the Edmonton Journal published an article stating that an aviation engineer named William Gilbertson was found dead in his hut somewhere in the valley on Con. Unfortunately, this brief note is all we know about the incident. In the same year, a forester named Ole Holmberg disappeared in the valley on Con. In 1945, Walter Tully, along with 2 friends, made a geological expedition to the valley on Con and found the badly decomposed body of a man lying in a sleeping bag on the bank of the Flat River, of course, with his head cut off. The police determined that these were the remains of a 40-year-old prospector named Ernst Sabat. As for what happened to him, they answered like this: "This guy was tired of hunger, so he climbed into a sleeping bag and died there. The animals couldn't get to the rest of the body, so they chewed off the head." In the fall of 1946, prospector Frank Henderson returned from the valley to Honey with a bag containing 30 ounces of gold and a frightening story. This fall, he planned to conduct field exploration with his friend John Patterson. Henderson and Patterson planned to meet in Virginia Falls in the spring of 1946, after which they would go to Watson Lake together. Henderson arrived from the Northwest Territories, traveling by dog sled, accompanied by a group of 5 Indians. Patterson was coming from the east across the Mackenzie River. By agreement, they left messages carved on trees. Prospector Frank Henderson arrived at the meeting place first, and when Patterson didn't arrive on time, he left his message on a tree before heading further into the valley, assuming that Patterson was delayed and would be able to catch up with him along the way. And once in the valley, on the first night, Henderson woke up from a strange howl. They set up camp on a rock, not far from the water, and strange sounds seemed to come from the bottom of the river. He found that his Indian companions had not slept for a long time and were extremely scared. They motioned for him to stay where he was, not to make any noise, and not to move. At the same time, the Indians feverishly extinguished the fire, covering it with a pot. The eerie sound, similar to crying, lasted for several hours. When everything finally stopped, Henderson turned to the Indians for an explanation, and they said they had seen white giants near the river. His guides were clearly scared, and so they immediately turned east out of the valley to leave it, instead of continuing down the Yuzhnyia River on the Con. And at that moment Henderson stumbles upon messages from Patterson. It was carved into one of the trees, and it said that his partner had entered the valley on Con. Henderson persuades the Indians to return, but they were so scared that they refused to return, and persuaded Henderson to go with them. Patterson was missing, and no trace of him was found. Moving on. In 1957 year, Leonard Brunchnick went to the valley on the Con in search of the lost gold mine of MacLeod. A few months later, his body was found on the slope of the Yuzhnaya Shoal on Con, lying face down in a pool of his own blood. In 1962, a pilot named Angus Blake Mackenzie disappeared while flying over the valley. They searched for him for 40 days, but neither he nor the plane was found. In the same year, pilot Kenneth Stockwell and 3 of his passengers, Victor Gooden, Gunter Hertz, and Henry Busa, flew through the valley on the Con. A month later, the remains of Stockwell's plane and the corpse of Victor Gooden were found near Virginia Falls. The bodies of Stockwell, Hertz, and Bruce have never been found. On the 22nd of June, 1963, 3 Swiss men, Martin Wuderich, Fritz Weissmann, and Wolfgang Mink, went down the river in a canoe on the Hanna. In early August, a patrol found the body of Martin Wuderich lying at the threshold called the 8. The corpse was in a state of almost complete preservation, thanks to the icy water. However, the cause of death could not be determined. But, apparently, he died before he drowned. Weissmann and Mink were never found. And surely you are tormented by a question. Really, for all these years, no one wanted to figure out what was really going on there. Okay, these prospectors at the beginning of the century, but now our story is approaching the 80s of the 20th century. This is practically our time. Wasn't anyone interested? Of course it was. For example, in 1978 year, an expedition of the American paranormal researcher Hank Mortimer went to the Nahane Valley. Moreover, his expedition was very well prepared. They had guns, walkie-talkies, and all modern equipment. And when they got to the place, the scientists reported that they had set up camp and were going to go deep into the valley. But in the evening, radio operator Ray Wilson's screams were heard on the air. He was screaming, "Emptiness comes out of the rock. It's just awful." Then the connection was interrupted. An alarm was declared, and after half an hour a helicopter with armed fighters on board arrived at the site of the expedition parking. But neither people nor traces of the camp could be found. The headless body of one of the researchers, Robert Veer, was found only 5 days after the tragedy. Another attempt to understand what is happening in the valley was made by the German magazine Spiegel in 1980. He sponsors an expedition in which he hires 3 retired American paratroopers. They had a lot of experience of survival, and they could stand up for themselves. Their task was to stay in the Valley of the Headless for a month, documenting everything that was happening. But 2 days after arriving in the valley, the former paratroopers sent a radio message, saying that the valley and they themselves were shrouded in something like fog. After that, communication with the detachment was interrupted, and people went missing. And one of the last messages I was able to find refers to the 2005 year when 60-year-old David Horse and Frederick Hardesty went to the valley to spend the weekend in one of the huts. They wanted to go fishing 125 kilometers northwest of Fort Simpson. The men went missing, and they were searched for almost a month. David's body was later found in a thick bush almost 4 kilometers from the hut, and Frederick's body was found in the Nordnahani River, about 20 kilometers from the hut. According to the investigator, Horse died of hypothermia, and Hardesty drowned. And probably everyone would have believed it, but David's brother personally participated in the search and told about the strange finds. Here's what he says: "There were traces of gunfire everywhere in this hut. We also found several shots to the floor. It wasn't like one died of drowning and the other froze to death. We found too much evidence that the police refused to take into account. For example, we found a brother's shirt with a big hole, similar to a shotgun blast. And the police did not even cordon off the hut, saying that there were no traces of a crime there. The families were outraged, demanded to resume the investigation, but this was denied to them. And these are just a few incidents that occurred in the Valley on Khan, or in the Valley of the Headless. In total, more than 50 people disappeared there during the observation history, and many of them were found without heads. The heads either disappeared altogether or lay at the feet of the bodies. But we will talk about what can happen there in the next issue.